I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the various models and theories of behaviour change. And this is quite dense and this is quite academic, but this is actually also quite important for people to get their heads around, because this will help design better policies and interventions. And there is about 50 years of really smart people's thinking, painful 5% of the brain kind of thinking, that has led us on this kind of journey of various behavioral models. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So just to repeat, we're going to talk about subtask 1 today. This is basically, we call it a helicopter overview because it really is about taking that kind of overview of the landscape, of the complexity. There is particularly on the theoretical side of understanding behavior and behavior change. And so we can then basically go and try and find a way. That's the Babel fish from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Any one of you who haven't read it, you really should read that book. And that's basically what we are hoping to be. We're hoping to be a Babel fish and translate the theory into practice so it's of use to you guys. So again, some definitions. We're basing this on the GSR review, which is probably the largest and most famous, though not enough used, review from the UK government. It was released in 2008, and it actually differentiated between 60 models of understanding behaviour and theories of change, and the difference being that the models that the behavioural theory, i.e. the models, is basically diagnostic, whereas the change theory is more pragmatic. But you do need both. It's not one or the other, it's like you do need both. You need to understand what drives the behaviour, and then you need to figure out how you can intervene. Oh, I need my iPad. Sorry, hang on. I've got some notes that I need. So we already talked about some of the caveats. And there's some caution as well. So models are concepts, not actual representations of behavior, as you all know, and that's not even needing to be very rational about it, but we're incredibly complex creatures, and so no single model or any model could actually fully visualize our complexity of behavior. So there's a total limit to how far models will stretch, and they obviously don't usually differentiate between people. They usually go the kind of usual human being. A lot of models have factors, but factors don't always precede behavior. Sometimes we just behave and it actually, changes the context of what we're doing. And factors are not always barriers. And with factors, we kind of mean contexts, the things that influence the behavior. They're not always barriers, they can be drivers as well. So Tim has created this framework. Tim is over there. Tim Chatterton. Say hello to him sometime, not now. Him and Charlie Wilson have developed this framework, which is basically looking at different aspects that you can ask yourself as a policymaker. Sorry about the colours, I hope you can read that. And I think you spend a lot of time thinking about this, Tim, and actually coming up with the right definitions and what kind of words you put in there. And Tim has worked with policymakers in the UK government, so this is supposed to already kind of make sense to the people in the room who are working in policy. And so basically it looks at 4 main things: who's enacting the behaviour, what are the influences or the contexts in the behaviour, what relationship does it have with time, and then what's the actual scope. And then when you put examples of different models through it, the first one up there in green, that's just the usual microeconomic, classical economics, rational, homo economicus, and this is kind of, in this framework, what is lit up. If you want to know anything about community or bundled kind of behaviours, then this is not the right kind of framework of understanding that behaviour. On the bottom is practice theory. I'm going to get into that a little bit more. And that is really looking at it from a social context. Doesn't look at individual behaviour at all. So if you're looking at individual behaviour, then that model will not be the right one for you to use. Okay, now to give you a little bit of an overview of the various models. There's a lot of big words because sociologists like to say things very complicated, but all of these actually you will know and will have applied at some stage. So the most common ones are the rational choice models. We like to think that we're rational, but we know we're not, mostly not. And that's the usual classical economics approach. And basically, most past attempts by government have favoured these tools, as we know, which are usually around information and incentives. And they plot a linear relationship between the government at the centre and individuals, and then base their strategy for behaviour change on a rational homo economicus kind of approach. But as we know, this is not a complete approach. Now, the information deficit models are a part of that. So it's basically, if we tell you how much money you can save and give you information of how you can change your behaviour, you will change your behaviour. Works sometimes, but it often also does not work. So the psychologists came in and started working with the economists, and they created what is called bounded rationality models. Behavioral economics is a discipline that really looks into that. And that basically looks at psychological things such as cognitive biases. If you type in cognitive bias into Wikipedia, you'll want to kill yourself because there's about 400 of them. Literally, it is a massive list of cognitive biases that stop us from acting like homo economicus. It's really worthwhile doing sometimes. Don't do it now, but do it sometimes. It's worth looking at it. It also looks at environmental constraints. So basically, the bounded rationality is to explain how when individuals are pursuing utility, their decision-making processes are bounded by their environmental and psychological constraints. And then the value-action gap, which is what we know happens between what people say they will do and what they actually do, it's a big gap, comes from social psychology. So this is going a little bit further than behavioral economics. And the gap is not a void. In this model, it's actually filled with barriers that are blocking the behavior to come to fruition. So, and in this model, the inaction is not down to an information deficit or a lack of rationality, but the decisional flow is blocked by other factors intruding in the process. So this is starting to get other factors into it rather than just not having the right motivation or not knowing enough about the topic. The single most commonly used and known of these is called the theory of planned behaviour by Eisen. You may not be aware that it's called the theory of planned behaviour, but you will have basically created interventions based on these kind of beliefs. And what it does, as I said, it includes additional factors beyond the attitudes as important predictors of behaviour. So like beliefs about outcomes, your own evaluation of outcomes, and then beliefs of what others think. So it starts putting in the idea of norms, so how you are actually in your social environment. But it still is a so-called ABC model in the sense that you go from left to right and it goes, if you have the right information and beliefs and think about what others think of you, then you will form an intention and you will create that behavior. And that is a very commonly used model to do interventions, because generally we think that if we push these levers and we take these barriers apart and we change people's attitudes and we change their willingness to do something, then they will form an intention and they will do a behavior. Again, doesn't always work like that in real life. In fact, somebody actually did that. They did a meta-analysis of pro-environmental behaviors, and they found that at least 80% of the factors influencing behavior did not stem from knowledge or awareness. That's 80%. Okay, so now we're going into social psychology some more. Now, the value-belief norms theory is very much around norms, and that is basically a person's perception that most people who are important to him or her think that he or she should not or should perform the behavior in question. So like attitudes, norms are specific to a behavior, and there's personal and social norms. But it says that they're constantly present in the cognitive processes. but they only exert a significant influence when they become salient. And then Cialdini, Robert Cialdini, very famous psychologist in the States, he did the experiments with the towels in hotel rooms, where he found that if you said that 40% of other guests reused their towels to save water, that had a significant increase in people reusing their towels than if you gave any other kind of information, be it environmental or cost or anything else. But he also made a really important distinction between two types of social norms, and they were the descriptive norms, which is what is done right now. So what you think is the right thing to do. Sorry, what you see other people doing right now. And then the injunctive norms, which is basically what ought to be done. And Cialdini found that using those injunctive norms, which are around what ought to be done, is actually really powerful. The norm activation theory actually includes emotion, which is quite important because, as we know, most of us are quite emotional beings. And it basically says that it's driven, the norm activation, so doing what you think is the right thing to do, is driven by a feeling of moral obligation, which is actually probably the case in a lot of cases. And then Triandis, he has a theory of interpersonal behavior, which, and I think Tim will agree with me on that, on these individualistic approaches is probably one of the most comprehensive of all the models, and has been used successfully by the UK government, for example. And that is basically how, as the experience of behaviour is acquired, the influence of habit increases and that of intention declines. That's what it looks like. So most of these socio-psychological models do not include external factors such as barriers, but in terms of like the comprehension of this, so you have beliefs about outcomes, the evaluation of outcomes, that's like the theory of planned behavior. Then you have norms and you have roles and you have self-concept, which are the social factors, how you are in your social environment. This forms attitude, this is the social factors. Then you have emotions and how they affect you. Then you have habits, which makes this more powerful than others because it actually includes habits, which are a really large part, maybe up to 80% of our behavior. And then it forms the intentions, and then you have facilitating external conditions, and then you get behavior. It's still a left to right ABC kind of model, which is you press these levers and you push these buttons, and then in the end you get out behavior. But it actually does include a really, really, really comprehensive amount of things to look at. And so if you do look at individual behavior and you want to change individual behavior, this is probably a model that is good to start thinking about what are these various boxes and how to fill them. And Tim has done some work, and also Andrew Darnton in the UK have both done some work with the UK government contrasting using this model and the practice theory model, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and how actually they're really good complements to each other. Because, like I said, there is no one model that's better than another. There is no one approach of looking at this that is better than another. This is a really good way for policymakers and implementers to think of it that you can change something. There's A plus B plus C plus D, and you understand how it works, and in the end you will get Z out of it. That actually makes sense. That is kind of a linear approach to our thinking. So as a model, this makes sense. But it's not always, it doesn't always work in real life, unfortunately. So the reason why it's called a dual process model of cognition, that's very important, is because it has the two paths, which is the intentional path and the habit path. And it's very important that it includes the habits, because as I said, the habits are actually something that drives behavior probably more than anything else. Now, the other one, which is a completely different way of looking at this, which is what the sociologists do, and they're called the socially oriented models. Now, in the needs, opportunities, abilities theory, it basically means that you include factors that are external to an individual, and then the abilities are like the internal factors. Cost spans both sets of factors, being a combination of price, which are opportunities, and available income, which is abilities. So you have opportunities, which is kind of the external stuff, and you have abilities, which is the internal stuff, which is incomes. And then, in this case, the barriers are basically constructs that reflect individuals' perceptions of external limits. So it's kind of sitting in the middle there. Now, the concept of behavior as social practice, which is getting more and more and more attention. Practice theory is like the big thing right now. It reflects the interrelation between these internal and external factors. And it basically means that behavior is produced between lifestyles and systems of provision. What it means is that it's not about the individual behaving. There is a practice, such as playing soccer, and that practice will continue even when the individual stops doing it. So you really don't look at the individual anymore. You just look at the practice being boiling the kettle. And then Elizabeth Shove created these 3 elements to basically explain it simpler. And that is, you look at the material objects that are forming the practice. In that sense, it would be the kettle, it would be the electricity system that gives you the ability to boil it, etc., etc. Images and symbolic meanings, which is the whole history behind it, the cultural tradition behind it, the value that you ascribe to having a hot cup of tea first thing in the morning, and then the competence, procedure, and skill, which is basically, to have the ability to flip the switch and to actually have electricity supply. So it's the physical objects, it's the interpretations and concepts, and it's the skills, know-how, competencies. That's basically a way of looking at it. Now, you can't read that, but with the UK government, they've actually, as I said, they've used this to get people, policymakers, to start thinking about things in a different way from this practice approach. And here's the example of line drying. So in terms of materials, they're talking, you need a tumble dryer, you need a washing line, is it retractable, you need airers, you need pegs, etc., etc., you need space. Around procedures, you have to have tumbling skills, the cost of electricity, energy labelling of tumblers in the EU, building requirements, knowledge, time, weather, daylight hours, everything in there. And then around the meanings you have, laundry is private, you don't want your underpants out in the air. Then ideas about freshness, like it's fresher if it's done outside. Status of class, line drying has low status in some communities, so they would never do it. It can be perceived as a green behaviour, so some people will do it. So there's a whole lot of things why line drying is really complex. And so basically, this is just one really simple action, line drying, a really simple practice, but it has a very, very, very complex amount of factors that are actually involved in the practice. And in order to change this from a practice theory component, and that's why practice theory is a little bit frustrating for policymakers, because you basically will have to work with a huge variety of actors and stakeholders, not just in government, but all around the place, in order to change this practice. But the great thing about it is, because you're not changing individuals, if you manage to change a practice, you have changed it globally or nationally. So it has a massive amount of possibility and opportunity, but it is a hell of a lot more difficult to get your head around how you can change all these different levers that are affecting it. Are you still with me? We're almost done. So now to just very quickly go to theories of change. Basically, they're the applied approaches. Social marketing is one of them. Pat knows about that from ECA. There's intervention mapping. In the UK, DEFRA, the environmental department, has created this model, which is called the 4E model. It's about encouraging, exemplifying, engaging, and enabling. And they've been using that a lot in terms of designing interventions all around the UK government, not just in the environmental sector. There is other theories. There is Lewin's theory, change theory, which is really famous, actually. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But it's basically a process in changing behaviour where the habitual behaviour is exposed to scrutiny by a group, and then it's allowed, basically you refreeze and unfreeze it. So you expose it to scrutiny. It's quite an emotional process. You really bear yourself emotionally, and then you basically just let it fall again. And it's about behaviour not being an individual thing, but basically based on group standards. There is the diffusion of innovations. A lot of you know that. It's a theory of change in the innovation sector, which is, like that S-curve with the early adopters and the majority and then the laggards. There's things like network theory and systems thinking and shared learning. All of these are theories of change. So very quickly, basically, with the unfreezing and refreezing, Lewin said that to change habits, it means revealing them to a group standard and then adjusting them. So basically it's an emotional stir-up which breaks the shell of complacency, because often their habits, they're unintentional, they're intuitive, they're instinctive, we don't think about them. So if you actually take them out and you discuss them in a group setting, and some information campaigns do that, you suddenly go, oh, okay, maybe it's not a good thing to do. The second one, which is vigilant monitoring, which is basically you change the context in which a behavior occurs and then you disrupt that process. So for example, you avoid places where you have unwanted habits, or you avoid people who you do unwanted things with. So it means, I can't drink when there are smokers around because I may be, falling back to old triggers and start smoking after a few glasses of wine. Then there is the if-then plans, the implementation intentions, and they are often used and they're actually really successful. And that basically just means working with people and get them to go, if X occurs, then I will do Y. So it's just a simple if-then plan that makes you look at a habit and go, okay, next time I do this, I'll think, if this happens, a trigger, then I will do this instead. Now the problem with all three of them is that that only works if individuals are already ready to change their habits. So they need to be done really quickly. Actually, this is not something that you can, piss around with for a long time. You really need to get them done quickly and then basically let it go and have people just work on it. They're not easily scalable, of course, as well, because you have to work with people really intensely. So one of the things that's probably the most useful for people like policymakers or implementers is moments of change. And it is a social construct again, rather than an individual one. The other three are more individual. Moments of change is you get people when they're actually having a big disruption in their life, when they're pregnant, when they're moving house, when they're moving out of house for the first time as students, when they're old and they're retiring, when they're making a big purchase, whatever. These are moments of change, and this is a really good time to hit people and actually completely change a habit. And that's basically the thing in practice. In practice, you basically need to completely rearrange these elements like we saw before with line drawing. And then there's this looped feedback. So if you look at any kind of practice approaches, you'll always see that there's a loop. If you see individual approaches, you usually see that it's linear. So that's often how you can tell the difference between a social approach and an individual approach. The individual approach goes like this, and the social approach is this constant kind of looped feedback where you always kind of need to have those various actions working together. And this is the last slide, so we're hopefully going to have breakfast now after all this very dense stuff. So what we're trying to do is to collect case studies that have actually used various models of understanding behavior or theories of change in the various countries and see how they worked out. Get the pros and cons, really dig into it, find out what was good about it, what was not so good, how they were evaluated, how the outcomes were measured, and then be able to say, if somebody wants to use a certain model, or if somebody is thinking about, changing driver behavior in transport, then here are the ways this has been approached in the different countries with the different examples, and they worked because of that or didn't work because of that. So that's the idea behind it, and so that's what we're collecting. And so if you know anything in the New Zealand context, and I do realize that most of you who have designed programs or policies have not thought I will use Triandy's TIB model to do that. But when you think about it, you will have had a certain understanding of the behavior you want to change in mind before you design something. You didn't just go and design it willy-nilly. You will have gone, if I give people information and I give people financial incentives, then they will do what I say. And then maybe you have gone, actually, I also need to actually go and see how other people are doing, and so you chuck some social marketing into that, So you will have had, you may not have gone, I followed this model, but you will have followed a model by doing so. And so I really encourage you, please, to help us for the New Zealand context. Collect some good case studies for New Zealand, and with good, I mean also ones that didn't work. We're really interested in the ones that didn't work because they are usually the ones you can learn from the most. And that's what we're basically doing in this task. And that's what we're hoping to then bring back to you as a kind of combined way of looking at it in a wiki where it's all interlinked. So you can actually go straight into the thing that you're interested in rather than having to dig yourself through a 100-page report.